It was the middle of autumn when I decided to take on the project. The air had turned crisp, the kind of cold that wraps itself around your bones and makes every breath feel sharp. I was in my mid-30s, living alone after a string of failed ventures in the city. The routine had worn me down, and I needed an escape. So, I decided to take a break from everything and build a small cabin deep in the woods. The cabin wasn't going to be anything fancy. A simple one-room structure, just enough to give me a place to breathe without the noise of the world. I found a plot of land, tucked away in the northern part of the state, far enough that no one would be able to easily find me. The area had a small, winding creek nearby, surrounded by dense pine trees that would provide ample privacy. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and far removed from the stress I'd left behind. I'd been working on the foundation for a week, mostly by myself. The weather had been unpredictable, with storms rolling in every few days, but it was manageable. The heavy rains usually came and went, leaving a wet chill that made my hands stiff, but the work was steady. I'd planned to have the walls up by the end of the month, giving me a few weeks of good weather to complete everything. It was the second week of October when the storm hit. The sky had turned dark early, clouds gathering like a thick blanket over the horizon. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and I knew something was coming. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture that pressed against your skin. I wasn't worried at first. I'd been through storms before, and they usually passed by quickly. But as the day turned to dusk, the storm didn't let up. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and the rain began to fall in sheets, hammering the ground with a relentless force. The thunder rumbled in the distance, each strike feeling like it was getting closer. It was one of those storms that seems to take over everything, filling the world with nothing but the sound of wind and water. I had planned to finish some work on the walls that day, but the storm made it impossible. I'd made the decision to hole up in the tiny tent I had set up next to the cabin site, hoping the rain would pass quickly. My tools were safely stored away in the half-built structure, and I knew I wasn't going to get any work done that night. By the time night fell, the storm had intensified. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches, and the rain poured down in torrents. The sound of it slamming against the canvas of my tent was deafening. I tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. Every time the wind picked up, it felt like the entire forest was shifting, like it could swallow me whole. I checked the weather again on my phone. The storm wasn't supposed to let up until morning. I knew I'd be stuck here until then, but it wasn't the weather that bothered me. It was something else, a feeling I couldn't shake, the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was easy to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the storm and the isolation were just playing tricks on my mind. But there were things I couldn't ignore. The creaking of trees, the snap of twigs in the distance, and the eerie silence that would fall every time the wind died down. It was a stillness that didn't sit right. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. As I lay there in the tent, I tried to push the thoughts away. I told myself that it was just the storm making everything feel more intense. But then I heard it, a low, distant sound that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a thud, then another. I froze, my heart racing. The sound wasn't coming from the trees or the ground. It was coming from the direction of the half-built cabin. Someone or something was out there, moving in the darkness. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling. I couldn't tell if the sound was real or if it was just my imagination, but I knew I had to check. If it was an animal, I could deal with that. But if it was something else, I wasn't sure I was ready for that. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle as I stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The wind had shifted, and the trees whispered above me. I squinted into the darkness, my flashlight beam slicing through the wet night. The cabin site was a good 100 yards away, and the woods surrounding it were thick with shadows. I couldn't see anything at first, but then my eyes caught something. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing where I had been working earlier, stood a figure. A man, or at least someone shaped like a man, standing motionless. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person standing still in the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone out here. I had made sure of that. But here he was, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of a storm, standing like he didn't care about the weather at all. I called out, but my voice felt small against the backdrop of the storm. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. I took a step toward him, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a feeling of unease that gripped my chest. There was something wrong about the way he stood there. Too still, too unnatural. I couldn't take my eyes off him. As I took another step, I saw something else that made my stomach churn. The man was holding something. In the dim light, it looked like a tool, a heavy, sharp object that gleamed in the flashlight beam. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The rain pelted against my face as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I thought about grabbing my phone and calling for help, but the thought of taking my eyes off him made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, the man moved. It was quick, too quick. He darted to the side, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do. Should I follow him? Should I stay put? I didn't know. But then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and quick, rushing toward me from the trees. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead. The wet ground was slippery, and I stumbled forward, my heart thumping harder with every step. I couldn't think, couldn't focus, just run. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but then I heard something else. A loud crash, like something large falling, followed by a string of curses. My pulse raced as I made it back to the tent, sliding inside with a quick breath of relief. I didn't know what to think. The man wasn't following me. At least I didn't think he was. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the storm rage outside and the forest crack and groan under its weight. I didn't dare venture out again, though I wasn't sure what I'd seen. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, and the world outside was eerily still. The forest looked different, quieter somehow, as though it had swallowed the events of the night and decided to forget. I didn't stay another night. The cabin wasn't finished, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The encounter, if that's what it was, left me unsettled, questioning everything I thought I knew about the place. I packed up my gear, leaving the half-built structure behind. It was supposed to be a retreat, a sanctuary. Instead, it had turned into something darker, something I couldn't quite explain. I left the woods that day, driving back to the city. I never went back to finish the cabin. Something about the place still calls to me, but I know better now. Some things are meant to be left alone. Some places are meant to stay undisturbed. And as for the man I saw in the storm, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I can't forget the way he stood there, motionless, like he was waiting for something or someone. The idea of renting a cabin in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect at the time. I'd been stuck in the grind of city life for months, and when the opportunity came up to take a weekend off to recharge, I jumped on it without a second thought. The location was an isolated forest, deep enough to keep me away from distractions, but close enough to the nearest town that I wouldn't feel totally cut off. The cabin itself, advertised as a modern, glass-walled escape, sounded like the perfect way to get back to nature without sacrificing comfort. It promised a peaceful, quiet retreat where the sounds of the forest would replace the noise of everyday life. What could go wrong? I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was as advertised, an architectural marvel with large glass panels covering almost every wall. From the outside, it looked almost too sleek for the forest, like a clean cut in a rough world. I parked the car, grabbed my things, and made my way to the front door. The quiet hit me immediately, not just the usual calm of nature, but a kind of silence that was almost oppressive. There were no birds singing, no breeze rustling through the leaves. Felt wrong, but I brushed it off as an odd coincidence. Inside, the cabin was just as modern and minimalistic as the photos had shown. The furniture was sparse but comfortable, and the wide glass panels provided an uninterrupted view of the surrounding forest. The trees outside were dense, their thick trunks and branches creating an almost impenetrable wall of green. A small creek ran behind the cabin, its trickling sound providing the only noise. I unpacked quickly and decided to take a walk around the property before the sun set. The forest was beautiful, with tall pines and oaks, their leaves beginning to turn with the approaching fall. But as I walked further from the cabin, the eerie silence started to press on me again. It wasn't just the absence of animal sounds. It was a lack of life altogether. No squirrels darting across the ground, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling and returned to the cabin to make dinner. After eating, I settled down in front of the fireplace, trying to enjoy the quiet, but something kept nagging at the back of my mind. I couldn't pinpoint it, but I felt like I was being watched. I'd never been an anxious person, but there was something about this place that unsettled me. I pushed the thought aside and decided to head to bed early. The night was uneventful at first. The cabin was warm, and the bed was comfortable. The glass walls provided a view of the forest even as I lay in bed, and I found myself staring out into the dark. The only light was the soft glow of the moon filtering through the trees. But just as I started to drift off, I heard something. It was a sound I couldn't identify, scratching, almost like claws on glass. My heart raced. I jumped up, scanning the room, but there was nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor, but no figure stood in them. I brushed it off as a branch scraping against the glass, though I hadn't seen any trees near the cabin with branches that low. Still, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The night dragged on, and I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. But it wasn't long before I woke again, this time to the sound of something heavier. A thud, followed by a low grunt, came from outside. I sat up, wide-eyed, straining my ears to hear. There was nothing, just the usual night sounds, but the unease lingered. I lay there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I decided to go out for a hike to clear my head. Maybe I just needed to get some exercise and fresh air to reset my mind. The sun was up, but the forest still felt eerily quiet. I walked for hours, trying to push aside the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but the silence was almost suffocating. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out, that I noticed something strange. There was a small shack, barely visible through the brush. It wasn't in the brochures for the cabin, and it certainly wasn't part of the planned property. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way toward it. The closer I got, the more I realized it was in a state of disrepair. The wooden planks were cracked and rotting, and the roof had caved in on one side. It didn't look like anyone had used it for years, but what was it doing here in the middle of nowhere? I approached cautiously, peering inside through the broken windows. It was dark and musty inside, but I could make out a few old, discarded tools and some crates. The place felt abandoned, like it hadn't seen a living soul in decades. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I didn't want to stick around for too long, so I turned back toward the cabin. As I made my way back, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the dirt leading away from the shack. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate. Human tracks. I followed them for a while, my heart racing with each step, but the tracks eventually disappeared into the dense undergrowth. Whoever had made them wasn't around anymore. I hurried back to the cabin, trying not to panic. That night, I decided to keep the lights on inside the cabin, even though I usually preferred the quiet darkness. Felt like I needed the comfort, the feeling of safety. I sat in front of the fire again, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking out the glass walls, half expecting to see a figure standing just outside, watching me. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scratching noise. This time it was louder, more frantic. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Came from the glass walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and crept toward the window. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what was outside. There, standing just beyond the glass, was a man. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, and his face was obscured by the shadows of the trees. I didn't know what to do. I backed away slowly, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was someone who had wandered off the trail, someone who had gotten lost. But the tracks, they hadn't looked like anyone lost. They looked intentional. I called the local sheriff's office, hoping to get some reassurance, but the phone just rang. No answer, no message. I felt trapped, as though the world outside had turned its back on me. The man never moved, standing still just outside the glass, his presence a constant weight in the room. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His stillness was worse than if he had been pacing or moving around. Felt like he was waiting for something. Eventually, I gathered the courage to stand and move toward the door. But before I could reach it, I heard a sharp knock on the glass. I froze, my heart almost stopping. The man outside didn't move, but the noise was unmistakable. A sharp, deliberate knock. Something inside me snapped, and I bolted for the back door, slamming it shut behind me as I ran into the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, where I flagged down a passing car. I didn't look back. I didn't even know if the man was still there. The sheriff showed up a few hours later. They did a quick search of the area, but there was no sign of anyone near the cabin. No man, no tracks. It was as if he had never been there. The sheriff assumed it was just my imagination or maybe someone playing a prank, but I knew what I saw, and I wasn't going back to that cabin. The rest of my trip was spent in a nearby motel. I never found out who the man was or why he was there, but I'll never forget that glass cabin in the woods, and I'll never forget the silence that came with it. I'd never thought a quiet weekend at a cabin could turn so unsettling. Maybe it was the isolation or the weather that had been slowly getting worse as the hours dragged on, but it all started to feel wrong. I had come to this place to escape the constant noise of the city, to get away from the phone calls, the emails, and the hum of the world that never seemed to shut off. It was supposed to be just me and my dog, Max. The cabin, perched in the remote woods of northern Idaho, was small but comfortable, tucked among towering pines and thick underbrush. Max, a German Shepherd mix, was my constant companion, my friend, and my protector. We'd been through a lot together, and I always trusted him to alert me if something was off. We'd arrived the evening before, a little later than planned, and I hadn't had the chance to explore much. I didn't mind. There was a trail nearby I'd meant to hike, but the rain had started falling, soft at first, then heavier, until the sound of it on the cabin's roof was the only thing I could hear. I'd always preferred the rain. It had a soothing quality to it, like nature was in conversation with itself. But as the night grew darker, I began to feel something else stirring beneath the familiar noise of the rain. The eerie sense that something wasn't right. Max had been acting strange since we arrived. At first, I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings. He sniffed every corner of the cabin, paced in and out of the rooms, his ears perked as if listening for something. I figured it was just the new place, but it lingered, this tension in the air. The cabin had an old smell to it, a mixture of wood, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. It had been years since anyone had lived in it permanently, and it showed. There were patches of peeling paint on the walls, a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time, and shelves filled with old books and trinkets covered in cobwebs. Still, it had a certain charm, the kind of place you'd see in a painting, peaceful, isolated, perfect for a retreat. But as night settled in, it felt more like a place abandoned by time itself, left to quietly rot away. Max lay by the door, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were fixed on the darkness outside, and I could tell he was uneasy. I'd put some wood in the stove to keep the chill at bay, and I settled into one of the armchairs near the fire, staring into the flames. The rain tapped softly against the cabin's windows, but then came the sound. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the rain. I thought it was just the wind pushing through the trees, but then Max's ears shot up. His body stiffened. I froze. A soft, scratching noise came from outside, just beneath the window. I wasn't sure if I imagined it. The wind? A squirrel? I wasn't sure. But then Max growled, low, deep, and full of warning. I stood up, moving slowly so I wouldn't make a sound. I peeked through the window blinds, trying to peer through the rain-soaked glass into the dark forest. The wind whipped the trees around, casting strange shadows on the ground. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight off the counter and carefully made my way to the door, trying to keep my movements quiet. Max was already ahead of me, his body tense, tail straight, ears pricked forward. He knew something was wrong, and I trusted him to pick up on things I couldn't. When I stepped outside, the rain hit me like a cold slap. The ground was muddy and slick beneath my boots, but I forced myself to keep moving. Max didn't need me to tell him what to do. He was already sniffing the air, his nose to the ground, moving in the direction of the noise. He was on alert now, ears twitching, eyes darting around the dark woods. I shone the flashlight ahead of me, cutting through the rain, but all I could see were trees and shadows, endless stretches of wet underbrush. The forest around me seemed alive, whispering in the wind, but the more I listened, the more the silence pressed in. Whatever it was, it had stopped. There was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. Max barked once, short and sharp, then went silent. His head snapped to the side, and I followed his gaze, shining the light toward where he was looking. My breath caught in my throat. There, just at the edge of the trees, a figure stood. It wasn't a man, not exactly, though it looked human. The shape was tall, too tall, and its posture was wrong. It hunched over in a way that seemed unnatural. The light flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw it move, but when I blinked, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. I heard Max growl, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait for a second look. I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, Max close behind me, his nails clicking on the wood as he ran. I slammed the door behind us, locked it, and stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. It had to be some kind of animal, I thought. Maybe a bear or something else that had wandered too close. I tried to convince myself of that, but something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't. The way it moved, the way it just stood there watching, it wasn't right. Max didn't settle back down. He paced around the cabin, moving from one window to another, stopping every so often to stare out into the dark woods. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but it was hard with my mind racing. The silence that filled the cabin felt oppressive, suffocating. Even with the fire crackling, the storm outside seemed louder, angrier. Hours passed, though it felt like time had stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. Max was on edge, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders tense every time he heard a noise outside. I wasn't going to be able to sleep tonight. It was impossible to relax with the fear gnawing at me, but I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, terrified, so I decided to check the perimeter. Armed with my flashlight and a dull kitchen knife, I stepped outside once more. The rain had let up a little, though the night was still thick with mist and shadows. Max stayed close behind me, his nose twitching in the damp air. I moved slowly, taking careful steps, my eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. But there was nothing. Still, I felt the eyes on me. I circled the cabin, checked every corner, looked under the porch and around the back. Everything seemed in order. The trees creaked in the wind. The occasional bird or squirrel scuttled in the underbrush, but that was it. Nothing that felt out of place. When I turned to head back inside, I saw it. Footprint. Large, deeply pressed into the mud right by the door, as though something or someone had been standing there just moments before I came out. The print was too large to be a bear's, too deep to be a deer's. It was human in shape, but far too large, with long, wide toes. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Max barked again, his voice high-pitched with alarm. I looked around quickly, then back at the print. Whoever or whatever it was had been close enough to hear me approach. It was almost as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I rushed back inside, locking the door once more, and collapsed against it, my heart thundering in my chest. Max was pacing again, but now he was whimpering, his eyes wide and fearful. It wasn't just the storm that had him spooked. It was something else, something that was still out there, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it from getting inside. The rest of the night passed in fits of anxiety. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. Max stayed near me, watching, listening, waiting for something. I had never felt more exposed in my life. Morning finally came, though it didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. The light outside was dim, gray clouds still hanging in the sky, but the storm had moved on. I didn't dare leave the cabin yet, not with the strange footprints still fresh in the mud. The thought of heading into those woods, knowing something was out there, filled me with dread. But when the sun finally broke through the clouds, I knew it was time to leave. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer, not with the unsettling sense of being watched still hanging over me. It was a short drive out, but as I packed up my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still on me, that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Max was the first to sense it. He didn't want to leave, kept dragging his feet, as if he were unwilling to go. His body language told me everything I needed to know. He had felt it too, whatever it was. And then, just as we were pulling away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The figure standing in the woods, just behind the trees, watching us leave. But this time, it didn't move. It just stood there, frozen, as if it were waiting for us to drive far enough away. I didn't look back again. I had always avoided this area, ever since she left. My ex-wife, Sarah, had a way of making everything feel more intense than it was. It wasn't until I found myself driving along that old, winding road again that I started to feel a knot in my stomach tighten. I never intended to come back to this place, but as I pulled the truck over on the side of the road and saw the familiar landscape stretching out in front of me, the old feelings came rushing back. The cabin was still there, nestled in the woods just like it had been when we lived there all those years ago. The trees hadn't changed much, though they seemed taller now, almost engulfing the cabin. The little stream near the property that we used to fish in had dried up, a casualty of the drought that had come and gone over the years. The whole area felt different, though. The air was thick, heavy with the feeling of abandonment. I was in my mid-30s now, and it had been 5 years since Sarah and I split up. Our divorce hadn't been messy, but it hadn't been easy either. She got the cabin, and I got the memories. Memories I wasn't sure I was ready to revisit. The drive up here had been uneventful. The kind of uneventful you only get in the middle of nowhere, where the roads are empty and the landscape is vast, but you feel like there's something waiting just beyond the horizon. There was no one else around, just me, the truck, and the quiet. Part of me wondered if this was a good idea. I stepped out of the truck and stood by the edge of the road, taking in the sight of the cabin from a distance. It looked the same, but different. The wood was weathered, the roof a little more saggy than I remembered. The front porch steps, once solid, now seemed to groan under the weight of time. It had been neglected, sure, but the feeling was there. This was her place. The place we spent so many quiet nights in. The place I thought would be home forever. I had no real reason for being here, other than to see what had happened to it since I left. Maybe I wanted some closure, maybe I wanted to see how she was doing. But after the divorce, I hadn't spoken to Sarah in over a year. She moved on with her life and I with mine. I knew she wasn't here. She moved into the city, remarried someone else, probably living a life that wasn't too dissimilar from the one we had imagined together. But the cabin, this land, was something we had shared, something I couldn't let go of. Not completely. The place felt heavier as I walked toward it. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, almost like the woods themselves were pressing in on me. The ground was soft, almost spongy under my boots. It had rained recently, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. I reached the cabin, and I stopped just outside the door. The air was colder here, like it had trapped the chill of years gone by. My hand hovered over the doorknob. It wasn't locked. Not that I expected it to be. Sarah had always been practical, and if she ever planned to sell it or move back, she'd want it easily accessible. I turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges sounded louder than it should have, filling the quiet woods with a sharp, unsettling sound. Inside, the air was stale, the dust thick. The furniture was still there, mostly untouched, though a bit worse for wear. The couch, once a deep green, had faded to a sickly yellowish brown. The kitchen table we had eaten at for countless dinners was scarred with scratches. The wood split in places. I walked further inside, past the old fireplace where we used to sit by the fire in the winter, wrapped in blankets, sipping coffee. I remembered the way she would smile when the fire crackled, how we would talk about the future, about dreams that never came true. I hadn't thought about it in so long, but being here again, I couldn't help but think of how different my life had turned out. I had hoped to find some closure here, but the memories only seemed to drag me further into the past. The second I stepped into the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The bed, which had once been neatly made with the quilt Sarah always insisted on, was now unmade. The sheets were rumpled, as if someone had been sleeping there recently. The idea of someone else being here made my stomach churn. I knew it couldn't be Sarah. She was long gone, off living her life. But who else could it have been? Her new husband? Or maybe some stranger? The thought unsettled me more than it should have. I left the room, my head swimming with questions I wasn't ready to face. I wandered outside again, standing on the porch, letting the cool wind settle my nerves. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows over the cabin and the woods that stretched beyond it. The sky was heavy, darkening as evening approached. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the growing darkness. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the light, but then the figure moved, slowly, methodically stepping forward into the open. I couldn't make out the details at first, but there was something about the way the figure moved that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't the movement of someone on a walk or a jog. It was deliberate. The figure was tall, but too still, too unnatural. And then I realized something that made my heart race. Whoever it was, they were staring directly at me. I didn't want to panic. I didn't want to run. But everything inside of me told me that this wasn't just some wanderer or curious neighbor. This was something else. The hairs on my neck stood up as I turned and rushed back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced as I scanned the room for anything useful, anything that might help me feel safer. My phone, of course, was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it before I left. Not that I was planning on staying. The only weapon I had was a pocket knife, and it felt like nothing against the uncertainty of whatever was outside. I stayed low, crouched near the window, peeking out through the blinds. The figure was still there, but now it seemed to be moving closer, its shape more distinct in the growing gloom. The person, or whatever it was, had an odd gait, almost like it was limping, but I couldn't see well enough to be sure. What kind of person would wander around these woods at this hour? Someone out for a walk? Or someone who had no business being here? The tension in the cabin was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't just wait here forever. There was no phone signal, no way to get help, and I couldn't just sit and let whatever was out there get closer. I gathered all the courage I could, grabbed my jacket, and left the cabin again, heart pounding, mind racing. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I walked through the woods, I kept my eyes on the trees around me, the shadows growing deeper with each step. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound, and I was hyper-aware of every noise. The woods felt like they were closing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the distance. My heart leaped. Someone was on the road. I sprinted toward the light, waving my arms to catch their attention. The car stopped, and I recognized the driver. It was an old friend of mine, someone I hadn't seen in years. He was surprised to see me here, but relieved too. Apparently, he had been driving by on his way to a nearby town. He offered me a ride, and without a second thought, I climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, at the woods that had once felt like home but now seemed so foreign and eerie. The figure was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been right to leave that place behind. The ride was quiet, but my mind kept replaying what had happened. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I never went back. The cabin was no longer a place of memories or closure. It had become something else, something better left behind, locked away in the past. It had been a long week of work. I was tired, sore from the constant lifting and moving of materials at the construction site, and the only thing I could think of was getting some peace and quiet. My brother, Jared, had a small cabin up in the mountains about 3 hours outside the city, and he'd invited me out to stay for the weekend. He always said the place was great for clearing your head, and I'd been meaning to get away for a while, so I figured now was as good a time as any. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just some much-needed relaxation. The cabin was tucked away in a dense forest, a spot that felt worlds away from the busy city. Jared had mentioned the location a few times before, but I'd never been up there. The road leading to it wasn't exactly easy to navigate. It was narrow and bumpy, filled with sharp turns and steep inclines. The kind of place where you'd need a good off-road vehicle to get through without too much trouble. I didn't have that, but I'd rented a decent four-wheel drive truck for the weekend, so I figured I could handle it. The drive took longer than I expected, mostly due to the rugged nature of the roads, but eventually, I reached the turnoff to the cabin. There was a faded wooden sign that barely hung on its last nail, reading Ridgeview Cabin. A little more than 100 yards down that road, I found the cabin, nestled against the base of the mountain, surrounded by a tall line of trees that shielded it from any real view. The cabin itself looked exactly how I imagined. A simple, wooden structure with a pitched roof, small windows, and a porch with a couple of chairs. Nothing extravagant, just a place to escape. Jared wasn't there yet, but that was fine. I wanted some time alone before he showed up. I got out of the truck, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the smog of the city. It was quiet, too quiet. Not even the usual sounds of birds or insects filled the air, just stillness. As I approached the front door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. Jared was usually meticulous about locking up, so I thought it was strange that it was open. I pushed it gently with my hand, and it creaked on its hinges as I entered. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the light filtering through the small windows. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom. It looked like Jared hadn't been there in a while. The place was simple, but it felt lived in. A small living room with a couple of worn sofas, a coffee table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in months. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a refrigerator, and a sink. The only thing that caught my attention was a strange smell. It wasn't bad, but it was off. Something sour like wet wood or mold. I figured the place had been sitting and used for a while, so I just shrugged it off. I wandered around, inspecting the place a bit more. In the back room, I found a small bedroom with a simple bed, a couple of chairs, and a dresser. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in an eerie shadow. I stood in the doorway for a moment, thinking about how I could make the place a bit more comfortable. It felt like something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tossed my bag onto the bed and decided to sit outside and enjoy the view. The porch overlooked a steep hill, and beyond that, the mountains stretched out into the distance. It was serene. I could hear the wind rustling the trees, but still, that quiet feeling hung in the air. It made my skin crawl a bit, but I didn't want to think too much about it. After a while, Jared pulled up in his beat-up old truck. He got out with a big grin on his face and slapped me on the back. "You made it," he said. I nodded, though I was still a little unsettled by the strange vibe the place gave off. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, it's great. Just needed a break. You'll see." He walked into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him. I followed him in, and we started talking about work and the usual stuff, nothing too deep. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, we sat outside around a fire pit Jared had built. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. We had a couple of beers, and it wasn't long before the conversation drifted into silence. The night sky was clear, and the stars shone so brightly that it felt like they were just within reach. It was peaceful, but I couldn't help but notice the odd quietness around us. No coyotes howling, no wind rustling the leaves, just stillness. As the night grew darker, the chill in the air set in. Jared seemed relaxed, leaning back in his chair and staring into the fire. But for some reason, I couldn't let myself get comfortable. My thoughts kept drifting back to the door being ajar when I first arrived, to the smell inside the cabin, to that strange feeling of being watched. I didn't want to mention it to Jared, though. He had a way of brushing things off, saying I was being paranoid. And maybe I was, but that nagging feeling didn't go away. Around midnight, we called it a night and headed inside. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside, but it didn't ease the strange tension that hung in the air. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. But I eventually drifted off to sleep, though not peacefully. The next morning, Jared and I decided to take a hike up the trail that started just behind the cabin. It was a narrow, winding path that led through the dense woods and eventually to a small overlook where we could see the valley below. I was hoping the hike would clear my mind and help me forget about the odd sense of unease that had been following me since I arrived. We spent a few hours on the trail, stopping to catch our breath and talk, but even then, I couldn't escape that feeling. It was like we were being watched from the trees. I tried to brush it off, but every crack of a twig or rustle of the wind made me tense up. By the time we reached the overlook, I was relieved to get some distance from the cabin, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. We made our way back down the trail and returned to the cabin, where we found the door was open again. It didn't make sense. We'd both locked it when we left. Jared didn't seem concerned, just muttering something about the wind or maybe a raccoon, but I knew something was wrong. We went inside, and as soon as we did, I noticed something. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the cabin itself was closing in around us. I could hear Jared rummaging around in the kitchen, but I was frozen in place, staring at the living room. The couch, which had been neatly arranged before, was now slightly out of place, as if someone had been sitting there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. Muddy, large, and fresh, leading from the door into the kitchen. They weren't Jared's, and they weren't mine. The footprints didn't stop at the kitchen either. They led into the back room, where the curtains were drawn tight. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding. Jared finally noticed that I wasn't following him into the kitchen. He looked over his shoulder, his brow furrowing when he saw the expression on my face. "What is it?" he asked, but I couldn't answer right away. I was too focused on those prints. "Who the hell's footprints are those?" I managed to choke out. Jared turned, following my gaze, and for a second, he just stared at the floor, his face paling. Then he stepped forward, following the trail into the back room. I didn't move, but I could hear him rummaging around, opening and closing drawers, checking the closet. After a few tense minutes, Jared came back out, his face hard. "There's nobody here," he said, his voice low and almost forced. But I wasn't convinced. I had to be sure. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The ground around the place was soft, and I knew I'd find something. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something strange. Branches were snapped near the tree line, and there were more footprints leading into the woods. It was then that I realized we weren't alone. Someone had been in the cabin, someone had been watching us, and now they were out there in the woods waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the trees, but it felt like an eternity. My heart raced, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure what to do. The fear I felt was like nothing I had ever experienced. After a few more minutes, I decided to go back inside. Jared was still standing at the door, watching me. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We both knew it was time to leave. We packed up quickly, throwing our things in the truck without even thinking about it. Neither of us said a word as we started the engine and drove down that narrow road. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, but the forest was silent. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then we didn't feel safe. I don't know what we'd stumbled upon at that cabin, but I wasn't about to stay and find out. Whatever had happened, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't alone up there, and I don't think we ever would be again. We made it out safely, but every now and then, I wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed. Maybe we got lucky, or maybe there was something far worse lurking in those woods than either of us could ever have imagined. It was the middle of autumn when I first stumbled across the cabin. The trees in the forest were in the final stages of shedding their leaves, their colors ranging from deep reds to crisp yellows. But there was an unmistakable chill in the air, the kind of cold that gets into your bones, one that doesn't leave you even after you've returned to the warmth of a fire or a thick blanket. I had been hiking alone for about 3 days, winding my way through the dense woods of northern Michigan. I wasn't doing anything special, just some quiet time to clear my mind. The year was 2022, and life had been a bit too much recently. I needed solitude, and nature was my way of getting away from everything, or at least that's what I told myself. The cabin appeared seemingly out of nowhere. One minute I was walking along the edge of a small creek, the sound of water trickling over rocks mingling with the rustling leaves. The next, I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of an old, weathered wooden structure, half hidden behind a veil of overgrown shrubs and trees. It looked abandoned, a place that had seen better days. Its wood was cracked, the paint chipped and peeling away in patches. The roof had several sections missing shingles, and the chimney was crumbling, almost as if the place had been forgotten for years. Despite its sad state, something about it intrigued me. It wasn't the cabin itself. There was something more, a feeling that this place had a story to tell. I paused in front of the door, the wood warped and warped so badly that the hinges were barely holding it in place. It seemed odd that no one had bothered to lock it or seal it off. But then again, the remote nature of the cabin made it unlikely that anyone would want to visit, let alone care about its condition. After a few moments, my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the faint, musty smell of rot. The place was dim, the only light coming from a few stray beams of sunlight that filtered through cracks in the walls and roof. I stepped inside carefully, my boots crunching against the dirt floor. The interior was a strange mix of decay and remnants of what once was. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered in a thin layer of dust, and a few chairs were scattered around. There was a fireplace on one wall, the hearth blackened with soot, but it had clearly been ages since it had seen a fire. What struck me most, however, was the sensation that I wasn't entirely alone. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the cabin was alive in its own way, breathing, as though it was watching me. I shook the thought away, attributing it to the isolation. It had been days since I'd seen another soul, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I wandered further into the cabin. The back room appeared to be a bedroom of sorts, though it was difficult to make out much. The bed frame had collapsed under years of neglect, the mattress long since disintegrated. There were remnants of old clothing scattered around, moth-eaten and faded. A dresser stood against the far wall, the drawers slightly ajar, revealing old, yellowing papers and broken trinkets. Then, in the corner of the room, I spotted something unusual, a small, leather-bound book. It was wedged between two pieces of wood, as though someone had tried to hide it. I approached cautiously, picked it up, and began flipping through the pages. The writing inside was faded, but legible. It appeared to be a journal written by someone who had lived in the cabin, maybe the last person who had called this place home. The entries were simple, a recounting of daily life, but they grew stranger the deeper I went into the book. The author wrote about feeling as though something was always watching them. At first, it was subtle, just a sense of unease, but over time it escalated. "I've heard noises at night," one entry read, "like whispers, soft at first, then louder. I can't tell where it's coming from." Another entry mentioned a strange man who had been seen near the cabin, just outside in the woods. The man never approached, but his presence was unsettling enough to make the author lock the doors each night. "It feels like he knows me," one line read, "like he's been following me for longer than I realize." The last entry in the book was chilling. I haven't seen him in a few days, but I can feel his eyes on me. I'm locking the door tonight, and I won't open it for anyone, not even for help. The final page was torn, and the rest of the journal was blank. I closed the book, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence around me. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I turned to leave, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, but as I reached the door, a sudden noise made me freeze in my tracks. It was a soft, scraping sound, almost like something dragging against the floor. My heart started pounding, and I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, but I saw nothing. I stepped out onto the porch, my pulse quickening. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees creak and groan. I stood there for a long moment, listening. There was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the house settling, but that feeling of being watched hadn't left me. Something wasn't right here. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard something again. This time, a distinct footstep, soft but unmistakable, coming from the woods behind the cabin. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively reached for my pocket knife, the only defense I had. I wasn't sure who or what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I backed away from the porch, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind raced, but I couldn't think clearly. All I could focus on was that sound, the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the woods behind the cabin. And it wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, and it definitely wasn't just my imagination. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was far away, not until I reached the main trail where other hikers passed by every now and then. I didn't look back, but I knew, deep down, that whatever had been out there was still watching. The next day, I went back to the area, but when I reached the cabin, it was empty. The door was wide open, and there was no sign of anyone having been there recently. The book was gone, the furniture untouched. I never found out who had lived there or what happened to them. But as I stood in front of that old cabin, something nagged at me. Maybe the journal's author had written about their experience, but perhaps that was just a warning. A warning I hadn't heeded in time. I've since left the forest behind. I haven't gone back, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear those soft, scraping footsteps. It was the spring of 2017 when I drove up to a remote stretch of woods in northern Minnesota. I was 39 back then, divorced for just under a year, and trying to figure out what life was supposed to look like again. I'd been working from home, freelancing in construction management, doing project plans and blueprints for small builders across the Midwest. The flexibility was nice, but it also gave me too much time to sit and think. I needed to get out, get quiet. That's why I rented the cabin. It was meant to be a reset. The cabin belonged to the cousin of an old friend. She listed it on a niche rental site that specialized in remote vacation homes. It was nothing fancy. One story, cedar plank walls, tin roof, a narrow porch. No TV, no cell signal, no Wi-Fi. Just the way I wanted it. It sat about 40 minutes west of Grand Rapids, off a gravel Forest Service road with no name. Once you got to the end of that road, there was a small clearing, a rusted-out mailbox with no door, and a thin trail leading back through birch and pine trees. I had to walk in about 70 yards with my bag and cooler because the trail was too narrow and rough for my SUV. The cabin was clean enough inside. There was a small cot, a propane stove, a pump sink, a wood-burning stove, and a battered desk by the window that looked out into the trees. I spent the first couple of days just adjusting to the quiet. I'd rise with the sun, brew coffee on the stove, and read or sketch for a while. Afternoons I'd hike or sit with a notebook and try to sort my thoughts. I even started drawing again, something I hadn't done since college. I sketched trees, mostly old stumps, branches. There was something soothing about all that shape and texture. On the fourth day, I found a narrow trail behind the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't marked and didn't look maintained. It curved off behind a thicket and disappeared into thicker woods. The light barely touched it, and the ground was uneven and packed with wet leaves and moss. At first, I only walked a few feet in before turning back. But something about it gnawed at me. It wasn't on the trail map the owner had left in the cabin. That got my curiosity going. I told myself I'd follow it the next morning and see where it led. I didn't mention this earlier, but I had this cheap solar-powered trail camera I brought with me. Mostly I used it for fun, to catch shots of deer or raccoons. I'd mounted it facing the clearing the first night and got a few decent shots. A fox once, then some does. But after I found that hidden trail, I moved it and aimed it toward the opening just behind the cabin. I figured if animals were using it, I might catch a glimpse of something interesting. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled and pressed against the cabin like something angry. The tin roof rattled, and I kept hearing soft thuds. I told myself it was pine cones or branches falling, but something about it sounded heavier. At one point, near 2 in the morning, I got up and lit a candle. Just sat on the edge of the cot, waiting to feel calm again. Eventually, I laid back down, but sleep never really came. The next morning, I checked the trail cam. I used my laptop to pull the images, and they loaded slowly, one by one. Most of it was empty frames, just trees shifting in the breeze. Then one caught me off guard. There was a man in the frame, not up close, maybe 20 feet down the trail. He was standing just off the edge, half behind a tree. Only the right side of his body showed, leg, arm, and part of the face. He was looking straight at the camera. I zoomed in. He was thin, wearing what looked like an old canvas jacket and a cap pulled low. His face was pale, eyes too dark to make out. But there was something off. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the stillness of him.
No mo tiemblar, no shift.
Just standing. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I checked the timestamp.
3:42 nachts.
I went outside, walked to the trail, looked down it. There were no footprints, but the ground was packed and soft. Could have been covered by leaves, I told myself. Maybe it was a hunter or someone from another cabin, even though the closest neighbor was supposedly a mile off. But the direction of his body, it looked like he'd come from the trail, not toward it, like he was watching. I should have packed up and left then, I think. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid. People hike in the woods. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he saw the cabin light and got curious. I made breakfast, sketched for a while, and by mid-afternoon I'd almost forgotten it. Then I decided to follow the trail. I packed light, water bottle, flashlight, pocket knife. The trail got rougher the further in I went. Brambles scratched my legs, and the air smelled damp, thick with rot. About a quarter mile in, I found what looked like an old hunting blind, but it was just a frame, rotted wood, and collapsed canvas. Beside it was a rusted steel drum half buried in dirt, and a pile of glass bottles coated in moss. I should have turned around there, but I kept walking. Eventually, the trail dipped down into a shallow gully, then climbed back up into what must have been an old logging site. The trees opened up, and I saw what looked like another cabin, smaller than the one I was staying in. Gray wood, collapsed porch, and a roof that had mostly caved in. No trail beyond it. It was the end of the line. I didn't go inside. I stood at the edge of the clearing, just staring. There were old cans hanging from strings on the porch, like wind chimes. I could hear them tapping gently in the breeze. There were dark shapes on the steps. Animal bones, maybe, but I didn't get close enough to be sure. I felt this wave of unease settle over me, like I'd wandered into something I wasn't supposed to see. I turned back fast and hiked to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat at the desk, staring out the window with the lantern off. I watched the trees sway in the dark, every shape suddenly full of meaning. I kept thinking about the man in the photo, about that other cabin, about how far off the map this all was. Around 2:30, I heard movement outside, soft steps crunching leaves. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps stopped just behind the cabin. I reached for the trail cam the second the sun came up. There was nothing. The battery had died overnight. It only got one frame, a blur of motion, something crossing fast from left to right. It wasn't clear, not enough to say if it was a person or an animal, but it was too tall for a deer and too upright. I packed my things that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I hiked out with everything in one load, got to the SUV, and drove until I hit paved roads. I didn't stop until I got to Duluth. I stayed in a motel there for 2 days before I went home. I didn't report it. What would I say? A guy showed up on my trail cam in the middle of the night, near a cabin with no name? That I followed a hidden trail to a place no one mentioned and found an old shack that felt wrong? I deleted the photo eventually. I kept the memory card for a while but tossed it after a few months. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd made it up in my head. But deep down I know I didn't. The weirdest part came 3 months later. I was bored one night and went looking for that listing again. The cabin was gone. Not just booked, deleted. No trace of it on the site, and when I emailed the owner, the message bounced back. I even checked the property records. The plot was listed as state land. No private listings anywhere in the area. I still think about that place. About the way that trail felt like it wasn't meant to be walked anymore. About the cans hanging on string, the bones, the stillness of that man's body caught on camera. But mostly I think about the way I felt when I stood at the edge of that second cabin clearing. The feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that someone had noticed me long before I noticed them. I've been to other cabins since then, but never alone, never that deep, and I never, ever follow trails that aren't on the map. I was 38 that year. My name's James Harrow. I'd worked construction most of my life, mostly roofing and framing in small towns across Oregon. That summer, work had dried up again, like it often did around mid-June when everyone either did their own renovations or left town for better jobs. I had some savings, not much, and was living in my truck most nights, just trying to stretch what little I had left. One of the guys I used to work with, Dale, told me about this cabin that needed repairs. His uncle used to be the caretaker for this old property out near Crater Lake. It was way off the main road, past a logging route that no one used anymore. The place sat just beyond an old graveyard that hadn't been touched in at least 50 years. People called the area Graveyard Ridge. Sounded stupid and dramatic, but folks around there didn't joke about it. They didn't like to talk about the place. Dale didn't go into much detail, just that his uncle had passed away the year before, and the family wanted to sell the land. But before that could happen, the cabin needed work. The roof was sagging, windows were broken, and some wildlife had made its way in. I figured I could stay out there for a week or two, fix it up, and earn myself a little money. They'd pay me under the table. I didn't ask too many questions. I drove out there on a Monday morning, late June of 2014. The sun was already high when I turned off the main road and started down the gravel path Dale had described. The road was narrow, barely wider than my truck, and overgrown in places. Trees leaned in on both sides like they were trying to block the sky. After about 20 minutes of slow driving, I passed through a rusted gate that hung half off its hinges. A hand-painted wooden sign above it read, "Graveyard Ridge, private property." The graveyard was the first thing I saw once I passed the gate. It stretched out in a wide clearing to the left of the path. Small, crooked headstones stuck out of the ground like broken teeth. Most were cracked, worn by time and weather. Some didn't have names anymore, just the faint outline of where words had once been. Iron fencing ran along the outer edge, bent and rusted with patches missing. Weeds had swallowed most of it. The cabin sat just past the graveyard on a slight incline. It was smaller than I expected. One story, one room, made from thick logs that had gone dark from years of rain. The roof sagged on one side like a broken shoulder. Windows were boarded up, and the front steps had collapsed into a pile of splintered wood. I parked about 30 feet away and stepped out. The air was quiet, still. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. It didn't feel haunted or anything. Not like in movies, but it did feel heavy, like the land was holding its breath. I spent the first hour walking the perimeter, getting a sense of what needed to be done. The roof would take the most time. I'd have to climb up, rip off the old shingles, lay fresh tar paper, and then put down new ones. The front steps needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Inside, I guessed I'd find rodent nests and water damage, maybe worse. There was no cell service, no electricity, no plumbing. I had brought a cooler, canned food, water jugs, tools, a hammer drill, nails, tarps, and my camping gear. I was used to roughing it. The first night, I slept in the back of my truck with the windows cracked. The sky was clear, and the moon cast long shadows across the graveyard. I didn't sleep much, mostly because I kept hearing soft noises. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, but they didn't sound like wind. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel. I sat up, held my breath, listened. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. Still, I left my boots on just in case. By the third day, I had the front steps rebuilt and had started clearing out the inside of the cabin. It was worse than I expected. Mice had chewed through the insulation. There were nests in the corners, droppings everywhere, and a foul smell coming from the back wall. When I pulled away some of the wood paneling, I found a dead raccoon wedged between the studs. Probably been there a year, maybe more. I buried it behind the cabin. There was something else I found that day, something that didn't make sense. Under one of the floorboards, I discovered a wooden box, nailed shut. It wasn't buried deep, just hidden under a loose plank near the back corner. The box was old, handmade with iron latches. I pried it open with the claw end of my hammer. Inside were three things: a leather-bound notebook, a rusted hunting knife, and a small tin container filled with what looked like dried herbs or leaves. The notebook was brittle, pages yellowed and stained. Most of the writing inside was in faded pencil, hard to read. But I could make out dates, some going back to 1961. The name R. Henley was written on the inside cover. That was Dale's uncle's name. I recognized it. The entries were strange. They weren't about hunting or repairs. They were more like logs, observations about the graveyard. One entry said, July 12th, heard footsteps outside again. Watched from the window. No one was there. Second time this week. Always around midnight. Another one, August 3rd, found bones near the fence. Small like a dog or raccoon, but the spine was wrong. Buried them. I read every page, cover to cover, that night with a flashlight. The later entries got worse. They talked about shapes in the woods, people standing between the trees. Once, he mentioned seeing someone inside the graveyard at sunrise. Standing still, not moving, not reacting when called out. Said he stayed inside the cabin all day after that. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I told myself it was just the writings of a lonely old man losing his grip. Still, I put the box back where I found it and nailed the floorboard down tight. The next few days passed slow. I finished sealing the windows and started patching the roof. The weather held out, bright skies during the day, cool at night. But every evening I felt watched. Couldn't prove it. I never saw anything, but around sundown, the woods went quiet, like something had stepped in and everything else went still. I kept my hammer close just in case. One night, on the 6th day, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the side of my truck. Not scratching, tapping, like a single knuckle knocking against metal. I lay frozen for a second, then sat up and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything, just trees and moonlight. I opened the door slowly, stepped out with my flashlight, and swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. I circled the truck. Nothing. But when I came around the back, I noticed something in the dirt. A single bare footprint. Not a shoe, not a boot. A human foot. Small, narrow. Maybe a woman's. But the toes looked wrong, too long, almost claw-like. I stared at it for a long time before brushing it away with my boot. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I decided I'd finish the roof and leave. I'd done enough. The cabin was livable, at least enough for someone to come in later and decide what to do with it. I packed up most of my gear and left it by the truck. I told myself I'd finish the last few shingles and be out by dark. Around midday, as I was hammering the last of the nails into the roof, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. In the graveyard, I froze. A figure was standing among the stones, near the center. It wasn't close enough to see details, but it wasn't moving. It just stood there. I stared for what felt like minutes. When I looked down to grab my flashlight from the tool belt, I looked back up, and it was gone. I climbed down, slowly, and walked to the edge of the graveyard. My heart was hammering in my chest. I scanned every stone. Nothing. No one. But there were footprints. Same as the one I saw by my truck. Bare feet, leading from the center of the graveyard to the edge of the woods, and then gone. I didn't finish the roof. I threw my gear into the back of the truck, slammed the tailgate shut, and got the hell out of there. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I was back in town, staying in a cheap motel and waiting on payment from Dale's family. I got a call from Dale's cousin, who was handling the sale. She told me someone had broken into the cabin, smashed the windows, tore down the front steps, even ripped the shingles off the roof. Said it looked like someone had gone after it with an axe. She asked if I'd been back. I said no. She didn't press. That same day, I went to the county clerk's office and asked to see any records they had on the Graveyard Ridge property. I had to wait a few hours, but finally got handed a box of old documents. Turns out the graveyard wasn't a public one. It was a family plot, belonged to the Henley family. Most of the people buried there were from the 1800s, but one death stood out. A woman named Claire Henley. Died in 1974, age 27. No cause of death listed. Buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property. There was one photo in the file, black and white, faded. It showed the cabin, freshly built, and a woman standing in front of it, wearing a long dress, barefoot. I didn't sleep that night. The face in the photo, I'd seen it, or something like it, in the graveyard. I never went back to that cabin. They never sold the property. Last I heard, the gate was welded shut and the road was overgrown again. The land just sits there now, rotting. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the footprints in the dirt. Still hear the tapping on the truck. Still feel the weight of being watched. And I know I wasn't alone out there. It was late fall in the mountains, the kind of time where the air starts to bite at your skin, and the forest, still vibrant with the last remnants of autumn, is beginning to fade into the duller shades of winter. I had taken a long leave from work, mostly to escape the buzz of the city and spend some time alone. I had never been one for crowds or the constant noise of urban life. It was one of those rare moments where everything seemed to be falling into place. I'd been meaning to get away for a while, so I took the opportunity to head up to a small, remote cabin owned by a friend of mine. His name was Darren, and he was a man who loved the wilderness more than anything. He had always talked about the place like it was his sanctuary, something sacred. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles away from any other human habitation, and that was exactly how I liked it. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of cool day where the sky was overcast, threatening rain. It wasn't a long drive, but it felt longer than it should have. I parked my truck by the side of the gravel path that led up to the cabin. The moment I stepped out, I felt the quietness settle over me, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little sound. Branches rustling in the wind, the distant caw of a crow, the scuttling of something in the underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and stays there. The cabin was simple, small, built with logs and a stone chimney. There was a porch that wrapped around the front, with a couple of old wooden rocking chairs. The place looked just as Darren had described it, weathered but solid. I walked up the creaky steps, unlocked the door, and let myself in. Inside, it was cozy. A wood-burning stove sat in the center of the main room, with a small kitchen to one side. A couch and an armchair sat by the stove, inviting you to just sit and lose track of time. The walls were lined with bookshelves, some of them filled with well-worn novels and others with hiking and survival manuals. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable. I spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up my stuff and getting the fire going. The storm clouds from earlier started to roll in, and by the time evening hit, it was raining steadily. The sound of raindrops on the roof, combined with the crackling of the fire, was soothing. I didn't have much planned, just a few days of quiet. I could already feel myself relaxing. I settled in with a book, a cup of coffee in hand, and let the world outside fade away. But as the night grew darker, something about the silence of the forest began to feel off. It wasn't anything specific.
No estrange noises, no weird sensations.
Just a feeling in the air that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it. After all, I was alone in a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest neighbor. What was there to be afraid of? I told myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But then, around midnight, it happened. I was half dozing in the armchair, the fire low, when I heard something. A sound, a soft rustling like something moving outside. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I stood up, walked over to the window, and peered out into the rain. The forest outside was thick with trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The only light came from the faint glow of the cabin's lanterns, casting long shadows on the ground. For a few minutes, there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the rain. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. And then I saw it, a figure. It was standing just outside the edge of the cabin's light, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it might be a person, but the way it stood, it didn't look right. The figure was unnaturally still, and its shape didn't quite match what a human should look like. Its arms seemed too long, and its posture was off, unnatural. The rain seemed to fall around it in a way that didn't make sense, almost as if it were avoiding the downpour. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart was racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I had been alone for too long. The silence and the isolation were messing with my mind. I tried to go back to my book, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It wasn't the normal sensation of being alone in the woods. Felt wrong, as if something else was out there, something that didn't belong. I got up again, checked the door and windows, double-checked that everything was locked. It didn't help. I felt like there was something outside, something waiting. The night dragged on. I barely slept, tossing and turning, the sounds of the rain and wind outside growing louder, more oppressive. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a tapping at the window. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the rain-smeared glass. Slowly, I stood up and walked to the window again, trying to steady my breathing. There was nothing there, but then I heard it again. This time it was more like scratching against the wooden side of the cabin. My first instinct was to grab something, anything, to defend myself, but my feet felt glued to the floor, and I couldn't bring myself to move. I don't know how long I stood there, my face pressed against the glass, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it again, the figure, but this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving, crawling along the side of the cabin, its long limbs scraping against the wood. It was so fast it didn't seem human. The way it moved, it didn't make sense. I stumbled backward, my heart in my throat. I rushed to grab my flashlight and open the door, stepping out into the rain. I shone the light in every direction, my hand shaking, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent again, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I spent the next few hours pacing the cabin, trying to calm down. The storm outside had picked up, and the wind howled, making the trees groan and creak. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I was that something was out there. Something wasn't right. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. At dawn, I packed up my things, still unsure of what had happened. But as I made my way out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. The drive back to town was uneventful, but even as I left the woods behind, I couldn't escape the sense that I wasn't alone. I never went back to that cabin. Years have passed since then, and I still don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or something else entirely, but the one thing I'm certain of is that some places are better left untouched. Some things in the woods should be left alone, and whatever I saw that night was something that didn't belong in the world of men. I was 34 the year I decided to take a break from my job in the city. It was late autumn 2017. I'd been working in logistics in a warehouse in Leeds for years, and the endless cycle of 12-hour shifts, stacked boxes, and humming forklifts had worn me out more than I'd realized. One morning, after an especially long week, I called in and told them I needed a break. Not the kind of break you ask for. I just told them I wasn't coming back for a while. Then I turned off my phone. I didn't have a solid plan, but I remembered my uncle's place, a rundown farm cabin tucked in the woods near a small town in Cumbria. His name was John, and he died 2 years earlier from a heart attack while chopping firewood. My family had left the cabin as it was, untouched. They talked about selling it, but no one had gone up there. It was too remote. No one wanted to deal with it. That's why it seemed perfect for me. I loaded up my old Citroen Berlingo van with some food, clothes, a few tools, and a couple of camping supplies. I had no expectations, just wanted silence, nature, and space. I wanted to cook simple meals, fix up the place a little, and sleep without alarms. I arrived mid-afternoon on a cloudy Tuesday. The gravel road leading up to the farm was half swallowed by weeds and potholes. I had to slow to a crawl, the tires crunching over loose stone, tree branches brushing both sides of the van. There were no signs, just a single rusted gate leaning off its hinges. I pushed it open, drove through, then left it like that. The cabin came into view a few hundred yards later. It sat at the end of a long, uneven clearing, surrounded by fir trees and patches of overgrown grass. The barn to the right of it was caving in on one side, the red paint almost gone. The cabin was made of heavy logs, darkened by weather and moss. One window was cracked. The porch sagged. I stood there for a while, letting the quiet press in. Inside, it smelled like wood and old ash. A few chairs, A table, some firewood, and a dusty stove stood where I remembered. The fireplace was filled with old soot and a few leftover coals. There was a bedroom in the back with a small bed and a sagging mattress. Mice had chewed holes in some of the bedding, but otherwise it was intact. I spent that first day sweeping, opening windows, and clearing out the worst of the grime. I made a fire, heated up some stew I brought, and fell asleep early under layers of blankets. It was cold but still. The wind moved through the trees outside like distant waves. I felt peaceful. That first week passed slowly and calmly. I chopped wood, fixed up a few loose floorboards, took walks along the tree line, and even managed to patch the roof with old tar paper I found in the barn. My phone stayed off. I didn't see a single person. The only sounds came from birds, wind, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I found a rhythm: wake up at dawn, cook, repair things, rest, read by candlelight. But then, around the 8th day, something shifted. It was a little thing at first. I found one of my work gloves missing. I'd left it on the porch after fixing a hinge. The next morning, only one was there. I thought maybe the wind had taken it or an animal. I searched the grass around the porch, the bushes, the space under the deck. Nothing. I let it go. Then one night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound. A dull knock, not loud, more like something gently tapping wood. I sat up in the dark, the fire still glowing faintly. I waited, listening. The knock didn't come again. I told myself it had to be something falling, maybe a loose shutter or a branch. I got up, looked outside. The trees stood still. No wind. I went back to bed. Over the next few days, more small things happened. I found a spoon from the kitchen stuck into the dirt by the woodpile, like someone had planted it. My hammer went missing, then showed up 2 days later sitting neatly on the porch railing. A pile of small stones appeared near the steps, arranged in a tight circle. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been digging or gravity had just done something strange. But the circle was too perfect, too deliberate. That night, I locked the door and put a chair under the knob, even though I felt ridiculous doing it. Around the 12th day, it got worse. I was walking down to the edge of the tree line after breakfast, just stretching my legs, when I saw footprints in the mud. Not mine. They were older, but not that old, maybe a day or two. Wide, deep tread. Work boots. They came in from the woods and ended about 20 feet from the cabin. Then nothing. No turn. No return path. Like someone had walked straight toward the cabin and vanished. That night, I stayed awake long past dark, sitting near the fire with the axe next to me. The wind picked up around midnight, but it wasn't loud enough to cover what I heard just after one. A slow, scraping sound along the porch, followed by silence. In the morning, I found the chair that had been on the porch lying on its side 10 feet into the clearing. Nothing else looked touched, but I couldn't explain the dragging marks in the dirt that led to it. They looked like someone had pulled it, slowly, carefully. I stopped walking into the woods after that. I stayed close to the cabin. I checked the windows before sleeping. Every day I felt like I was being watched. Not just the general unease you get being alone, but something specific. Like someone was out there, watching me move from the woodpile to the porch, watching me through the trees while I cooked, watching while I pissed by the barn. One afternoon, I found the barn door open. I'd locked it myself 2 days earlier, after finding raccoon droppings inside. I checked the lock, it wasn't broken. It had just been undone. Inside, a rake leaned against the wall, and beside it was something that hadn't been there before. A small pile of berries and 2 feathers, placed right in the middle of the floor. I didn't know what to make of it. There were no signs of animals.
No footprints, no droppings.
Just those items laid out like a message. I started sleeping during the day and staying up at night. The noises came more often, sometimes soft scratching, sometimes what sounded like breathing just outside the walls. One night, the door handle moved. I watched it turn slightly, then stop. I didn't breathe for nearly a minute. I didn't move, just stared at it, heart pounding. In the morning, nothing was missing, but the same pile of stones had reappeared on the steps, only now with a small dead bird in the center. That was when I decided I had to leave. It had gone beyond strange. I didn't want to know who or what was out there. I packed up my food, my clothes, whatever tools I could fit. The van was still fine. No flat tires. Nothing broken. I threw everything in the back and didn't look behind me. But the road out was blocked. About half a mile down the trail, someone had dragged several trees across it. Fresh cuts. Clean X work. Not windfall. Not storm damage. Someone had deliberately chopped and moved them there. And they were thick. Too much for me to move alone. I turned around, heart hammering. I drove back to the cabin and sat in the van for a long time, thinking. I didn't know if I should try walking out. It was nearly 20 miles to the nearest town, with no guarantee I'd find help. My legs were strong, but I didn't have enough supplies to carry comfortably. Plus, I didn't want to be caught in the woods after dark. So I waited one more night. That night was the worst. Just after sunset, I saw a figure in the trees. Far enough that I couldn't see a face, but close enough to be sure it wasn't a tree or a trick of the light. Just standing there, watching. Then it moved, slowly back into the woods. Later that night, the cabin creaked more than usual. The fire refused to catch properly, like the air was too damp. I sat with the axe in my lap, not blinking. Just before dawn, I heard something heavy drop onto the porch. A thud, then nothing. When light finally crept through the windows, I opened the door. On the porch was the missing glove from 2 weeks ago, and beneath it, carved into the wood, was a word. Stay. That was it. I grabbed what I could, threw it into a pack, and left on foot. I didn't stop. I walked all day, drinking from streams, forcing myself to keep going. I saw no one. But once, I swear I heard movement in the trees beside me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look. By the time I reached a service road, my legs were shaking. A farmer in a blue pickup stopped and gave me a ride to the nearest station. I didn't tell him everything, just said I'd been staying in an old cabin and had gotten turned around. I never went back. A month later, someone from my family finally went to check the cabin. They found the barn burned to the ground. No signs of animals, no signs of people, just the word stay carved again into the side of the cabin. They sold the land 2 years later. I live in a flat now, surrounded by neighbors. I don't camp anymore. I don't fix cabins. I don't go into the woods. I still don't know who was out there, or how long they were watching me before I noticed. But I know this. Somewhere out in those woods, someone's still there, and they didn't want me to leave. It was the spring of 2011 when I first went out to stay at the old cabin near Cimarron, New Mexico. I was 37 that year, still getting used to life on my own again after the divorce. I'd spent the last year working long hours at the factory outside of Taos, saving up some money, not really knowing what for. I didn't have kids. My ex-wife took the dog. My weekends were long and quiet, and my only real break was hiking out in the mountains every other Saturday, trying to tire myself out enough to sleep through the night. A guy I worked with, older guy named Mike, had mentioned once that he had an old hunting cabin out near the edge of the Valle Vidal. Said it hadn't been used in years and that I could take a weekend up there if I wanted. I said sure, not expecting anything to come of it, but 2 weeks later he handed me a small brass key and drew a little map on the back of a receipt. The map wasn't much, just a few jagged lines with a few written notes like "pass windmill" and "left at dead tree," but I figured I could manage. I liked getting lost sometimes. It felt better than being in town where everything reminded me of the past. I took Friday off work and packed my truck the night before. Just some food, water, tools, my old .22, and a cot. I didn't know what kind of shape the place would be in, so I brought tarps and a roll of duct tape too. I left around noon the next day and reached Cimarron a little before 3. The road leading up into the hills was narrow and full of turns, but it felt good to get away from everything. I passed that windmill Mike had scribbled on the map, then turned left at a tree that had long since stopped pretending it was alive. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by juniper and scrub pine. It wasn't much to look at. A single room with a sagging porch, a tin roof rusting through in spots, and faded green paint barely holding on around the windows. One shutter was hanging sideways like it had given up a long time ago, but it stood, and that was enough. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale but not rotten, like it had just been sealed off too long. Dust hung in the light streaming through the window slats. The floor creaked but held. There was an old wood stove in one corner, a small table, 2 chairs, and a set of shelves built into the wall. No electricity, no plumbing, no signal on my phone. I dropped my pack and started opening windows to let the place breathe. It was quiet, so quiet it made my ears ring. That first night I didn't sleep much. Even though I was tired, my mind wouldn't settle. The walls popped with the cooling air, and once or twice I heard a thump from outside. Maybe a branch or a deer moving past. Still, I stayed in the cot with my boots half on and the rifle leaned against the wall beside me. The next morning was cool and dry, sun coming in strong and bright. I made instant coffee over a little propane stove I'd brought and ate a granola bar for breakfast. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, just seeing what was around. The clearing stretched back into a little slope, and there was a dry creek bed maybe 40 yards behind the place. Past that, the trees thickened fast. That's when I saw the path. It wasn't much, just a faint line in the grass and dirt, half overgrown but definitely there. It cut into the brush behind the creek bed and bent sharply left, vanishing between 2 big rocks. I figured maybe it led to an old hunting blind or a spring. I walked over to the rocks but stopped when I felt the temperature drop. Not in a mystical way, just shade and wind, but it caught me off guard. The path beyond the rocks narrowed. Trees leaned in over the top, casting strange patterns on the dirt. I walked maybe 200 yards before I found what looked like a fire pit, long since filled in with debris. There were rusted cans, some old bones, maybe from a deer, and a few beer bottles so weathered you could barely read the labels. It looked like someone had camped out here years ago, then never came back. I headed back to the cabin. The rest of that day was quiet. I read a little, wrote in my journal, cleaned the place up a bit. I saw a coyote once, trotting along the edge of the clearing, nose to the wind. It glanced at me and then kept moving. That night, the wind picked up. It came down off the hills like a freight train, pulling at the roof and pushing dust through every crack. I sat up late, listening. A few times I thought I heard footsteps outside, but every time I looked, there was nothing, just branches swaying, leaves whipping past. I tried to sleep but kept waking, heart racing, not knowing why. The third morning, I woke to find something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Not boots, bare feet, and not mine. I wear size 11s, and these were smaller, maybe a 9. They led from the trees to the back wall and then stopped. No prints leading away. I walked the perimeter again. Nothing. I told myself maybe they were old and the wind had blown the other ones away. Still, I felt something tighten in my chest. I took the rifle with me when I stepped outside from then on. That afternoon, I went back down the path behind the rocks. I don't really know why. Maybe to prove there was nothing out there. But when I reached the fire pit again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Marks on a tree nearby, scratches, deep and wide, like someone had taken a hunting knife and carved into the bark, over and over. They weren't letters, just lines, angled, crisscrossed. They looked angry. I stood staring at them for a long time, then slowly turned back. That night, I locked the door with the key and pushed the table in front of it. I don't know if I expected something to try and come in, but I needed the weight there. I barely slept. The next day was colder. Clouds moved in from the west and the air felt damp, like rain wasn't far off. I decided to cut my trip short and head back in the morning. I packed most of my gear and kept my boots on, ready to leave quickly if needed. At some point after lunch, I heard a sound I still can't quite explain. It was a whistle, but not like a person whistling a tune. It was sharp, short, then silent. It came from the trees behind the cabin, near the dry creek. I stood frozen for maybe 10 minutes, just listening. Nothing else came, just wind. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, I saw movement in the woods. Not clear, just the shape of a person stepping behind a tree. I didn't go after it. I stayed inside, loaded the rifle, and waited. The final night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I didn't move much. Every so often, I thought I heard faint crunching outside, like someone shifting their weight from foot to foot. The wind came and went. Once or twice I thought I saw a shadow past the window, but it could have been the trees. Around 3 a.m., the handle on the door rattled. Just once. A gentle, almost polite jiggle. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Just stared at the door, the rifle shaking in my hands. It never opened. When the sky finally lightened, I opened the door and stepped outside. Nothing was there.
No footprints.
No sound. Just the trees swaying and the smell of rain on the air. I didn't clean up. I didn't say goodbye. I just threw my things in the truck and drove out fast, barely checking the turns, map forgotten in the passenger seat. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Back in town, I gave Mike his key. Told him thanks, but I wouldn't be going back. He didn't ask why, just nodded and tucked it into his pocket like he already knew. A week later, I filed a report with the sheriff's office. Not a full report, just a note about possible trespassers near the old hunting trail. They didn't do much. Said those woods were big and empty, and people passed through sometimes. That was it. I never went back. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear the wind outside late at night. About those bare footprints, the scratches on the tree, the whistle, the hand on the door. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. I don't believe in any of that. I think someone was living out there, or watching, or waiting. Maybe they thought I was trespassing. Maybe I was, but they didn't want to talk. They didn't want to be seen, and they let me leave. That's what I hold on to now, that they let me leave. Because the worst part is knowing there wasn't anything stopping them if they hadn't. It was late autumn of 2016 when I decided to get away for a while. Life had been dragging me down. I was 38, working long hours at a logistics firm in Birmingham, rarely seeing daylight, rarely seeing anyone at all beyond the same tired faces and the same cold screen glow. I needed time to clear my head.
No pubs.
No phone. No people. Just trees, wind, maybe some rain if I was lucky. A guy I worked with, Dave, had told me about a small cabin up in Cumbria near Grisdale Forest. His brother-in-law owned it and barely used it anymore. It wasn't listed for rent or anything like that, but he said I could stay there for free if I brought my own supplies. It had running water, a wood stove, and a decent roof. That was all I needed. I drove up on a Friday afternoon in my old Ford Focus, packed with food, a couple crates of bottled water, a flashlight, a proper first aid kit, and enough dry firewood to last a few days if the cabin stash turned out to be empty. I also brought a heavy-duty padlock, just in case the door lock was dodgy. The whole thing was supposed to be remote, no one for miles around. By the time I reached the turnoff from the main road, the sun was already starting to drop behind the trees. The lane was narrow and winding, barely more than a footpath in places, flanked by skeletal trees that reached over the road like fingers. The tires bumped over roots and old stones. I had to slow down to a crawl. There wasn't another car or house in sight. Just me, the car, and the woods. Eventually, the lane opened into a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It was rougher than I expected. Sloped roof, weathered timber, and a porch that looked like it would snap under any real weight. The place gave off an odd feeling, not haunted or anything like that, just forgotten, like no one had stepped foot there in years. I parked next to the porch and shut the car off. Everything went still. You know that sound? No sound at all, just the wind brushing past your ears and the rustle of trees in the distance. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The key Dave had given me worked fine. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A cot bed pushed up against the far wall, a little table with 2 chairs, shelves full of old tins and mismatched mugs, a wood stove with a steel flue. No lights, of course. I used the flashlight to check for mice or mold, but didn't find anything too bad. There was even a big stack of firewood under a tarp behind the cabin, dry too. I spent the first night reading by lantern and listening to the wind pick up. It got colder around midnight, and I had to throw on a second hoodie just to sleep. But it was good, quiet. No buzz of streetlights, no cars revving by. Just wind and the occasional snap of a tree branch in the distance. The second day was more of the same. I hiked around a bit, stayed within a couple of miles, just in case I lost track of where the cabin was. The forest was thick, full of rotting leaves and damp smells. I saw deer, a fox, and even a pair of badgers by the creek. It felt like I'd stepped into a different century. That night was when things started to change. I was back in the cabin by dusk, heating up some soup on the stove. It was dark outside already. I hadn't seen a single person all day, hadn't even heard an airplane overhead. I was about to settle in when I thought I heard something outside, crunching leaves. It wasn't loud, just a soft, steady tread, like someone walking slowly around the perimeter. I froze, bowl halfway to my mouth, and listened. Couple more steps, then nothing. The sound faded into the wind. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer. Still, I locked the front door before bed and wedged a chair under the handle. The cabin had one small window looking out toward the trees. I pulled the curtain shut and turned off the lantern. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, feeling like something was near. Around 3 a.m., I got up to use the bucket toilet I'd set up in the corner. As I finished and turned back to the cot, I saw the curtain sway slightly, like it had been pulled or moved from outside. I stood there for a full minute, staring at it. No movement. I finally walked over, pulled it open fast, and shone the flashlight through the window. Nothing, just darkness and the edge of the clearing. I went back to bed but kept the flashlight close. The third day, I didn't go hiking. Something didn't sit right. I kept thinking about those footsteps and the curtain. I checked around the cabin in the morning. No prints that I could see, but the ground was covered in wet leaves, so any tracks could have been hidden. Still, I saw something else. A small length of frayed rope tied around one of the porch posts. It hadn't been there the day before. It was old and dirty, about a foot long, tied in a loose knot. It didn't mean anything by itself, but something about it bothered me. I untied it and tossed it into the trees. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, keeping an eye out for anything odd. Bits of clothing, fresh litter, whatever. About 50 yards into the woods, I found a patch where the ground had been disturbed. Something had been dragged, maybe an animal, maybe not. There was no blood, just a wide mark through the leaves and soft earth. like something heavy had been pulled toward the trees. That night, I stayed up later, keeping the fire going longer than usual. Around 11, I stepped out onto the porch just to get some fresh air. The moon was out behind thin clouds, and I could see into the woods a bit. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a shadow, but then she moved just a step forward. She was maybe 30 feet away, right at the edge where the tree line thickened. Her clothes were dark, loose, maybe a long coat or dress. I couldn't make out her face, but her head was angled slightly downward, like she was staring at the ground. She didn't say anything, didn't move again, just stood there. I backed slowly into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't look out the window. I didn't turn off the lantern. I sat in the chair all night, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. In the morning, I went outside. She was gone. No footprints, no coat, no sign of anyone. But there was something new. A small pile of rocks stacked near the porch, for stones balanced on top of each other. Not natural. Someone had placed them there. I didn't touch it. I wanted to leave. I loaded up the car, but the battery was dead. I hadn't left the lights on. The battery was brand new. Got it 2 months ago, but it was dead, like something had drained it. There was no signal up there and no landline. The nearest town was nearly 10 miles away. I could have started walking, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone had been camping nearby and wandered past. Maybe the rocks and the rope were just leftovers from old campers. I stayed another night. That was a mistake. It rained that evening, heavy sheets of it coming down like nails. The sound on the roof was deafening. I sat in the cabin with the fire going, trying to read, trying not to think about the woods outside. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer, slower, more deliberate. They stopped right outside the front door. I held the flashlight and stood behind the table, heart pounding. Then I heard something slide across the door, like nails or fingers brushing down the wood.
Nonak.
No voice, just that slow, dragging sound. Then it stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When I finally opened the curtain just a crack, there was nothing there. But the stack of stones had been knocked over, and something else on the window smeared in mud was a handprint. Small, thin fingers, like a woman's. I didn't sleep. I waited until dawn and started walking with my pack. I followed the lane for over an hour until I finally got a single bar of signal. I called a tow service. They said they could get to me by late afternoon. I stayed outside the cabin all day, sitting on the hood of the car with an axe beside me, watching the woods. Nothing moved.
No birds, no rustling.
Just stillness. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver told me something strange. He said the battery was fine, fully charged. The car started on the first try. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and drove back to Birmingham without stopping. I never told anyone the full story, not even Dave. A few weeks later, I looked up old maps of the area, old forest land records. Nothing useful, just timber permits, park boundaries, old ranger stations long gone. But I found one bit buried in a local history forum, a short post from someone who used to hunt near Grisdale. He said there were stories from the 80s about a woman who used to live alone in a cabin up there. People said she had mental problems, that she disappeared one winter and was never found. Her cabin was left to rot somewhere off the main paths. I don't know if the one I stayed in was hers. All I know is I never went back. And sometimes when I'm walking home late in the city, I still get that feeling that someone is standing just out of sight. Not watching, just standing, waiting. It was late October 2016 when I decided to drive out to my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Maine. I was 32 back then, recently divorced, and working as a mechanic in Concord, New Hampshire. My life had fallen into this kind of static, hollow rhythm: work, sleep, bills. I needed something different, something to get me away from the noise in my head, and the silence of the woods felt like a good place to start. My uncle, Doug, hadn't used the cabin in years. He moved to Florida after retiring and left the place to pretty much rot. But he still paid the property taxes on it, and when I asked if I could go up there for a weekend just to get some peace, he said sure. He warned me the roof might leak, the generator probably wouldn't work, and that there might be animals nesting inside. I told him I didn't care. I just needed the break. I took Friday off work, packed my truck with a cooler, sleeping bag, camping stove, some canned food, a tarp, and my old .22 rifle. Not because I was planning to hunt, but just to feel a bit safer. I also brought a big jug of water, a few tools, and a battery-powered lantern. The place didn't have electricity or plumbing, but I wasn't expecting comfort. The drive took about 5 hours, mostly on winding back roads through old timber country. Cell service died about 40 minutes before I reached the turnoff. The cabin was tucked off a rough gravel trail you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. The last half mile was too tight for my truck, so I parked at a clearing and hiked the rest of the way in, carrying my gear on my back. I hadn't seen the place in almost 15 years. My dad used to bring me up there when I was a kid. We'd come up during deer season or just to fish the nearby stream. It was different being back as an adult. Everything seemed smaller and sadder. The front porch sagged to one side, the wood darkened with age and moss. A shutter hung loose on one hinge. It looked like a place long forgotten. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood and mice. The furniture was just as I remembered. 2 wooden chairs, a tiny table, a shelf full of mildewed books, and a rusted-out old stove in the corner. I swept out the leaves and mouse droppings, laid out my sleeping bag on the cot by the wall, and opened the windows to air it out. The rest of that first day was quiet. I walked the perimeter, checked the stream, and spent a few hours just sitting by the water, watching the light change through the trees. The only sound was wind and birds. Felt right. That night, I cooked some beans on the stove and drank a beer out on the porch, wrapped in my coat. The moon was full enough that I didn't need a flashlight. I slept surprisingly well, lulled by the creaks and groans of the old place. The second day was when things started to get strange. I woke up around 7 a.m., made some instant coffee, and walked down the trail to see if I could find any sign of deer or moose. There were some old tracks by the stream, but nothing fresh. I hiked out farther than I'd planned, maybe 3 or 4 miles west into the woods. It was mid-afternoon by the time I turned back. I noticed it about halfway back to the cabin. A tree, stripped of bark in long vertical lines, deep gouges into the wood. At first, I figured it was a bear, but the claw marks were too narrow and straight, and they were high, like 7 feet up. I stood there staring at it for a while, heart picking up a little. Further down the trail, I found something else. A pile of old clothes, just sitting there in the middle of a clearing. A flannel shirt, some torn jeans, and a muddy pair of boots. Everything was faded, stiff from the cold and damp. I poked at it with a stick. No blood, no signs of struggle. But it was weird. I didn't take anything, just moved on. By the time I got back to the cabin, the light was fading. I lit the lantern, ate some chili out of a can, and tried not to think too hard about what I'd seen. People dump junk in the woods all the time, I told myself. Maybe some hunter lost his pack. Maybe the claw marks were old. Maybe I was just spooking myself. But I didn't sleep well that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. No sound, no wind, just this tight, electric feeling in my chest, like something had changed. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to listen. First, nothing. Then I heard it. Asterisk, a single crunch asterisk, like a footstep on dry leaves. It was close, right outside the window. I stayed completely still, eyes wide open, heart pounding like a drum. There was another crunch, slower this time. Then silence again. I sat up and slowly reached for the rifle I'd left by the cot. I didn't load it, just held it. There was no movement outside. No breathing, no whisper of leaves. I didn't want to turn on the lantern and give myself away. I just sat there watching the window. Eventually, after maybe an hour, I lay back down. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again. No tracks, no signs of anyone. The woods were wet with dew, the ground soft. If something had been there, it should have left marks. But there was nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer wandered close. But the steps had sounded slow, deliberate. I thought about packing up. I probably should have. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to leave because of a bad night's sleep. Later that day, I hiked out again. This time in a different direction, toward a ridge I remembered from my childhood. I wanted to see if it still had that same view of the lake. But I never made it. I found something else, an old structure, half buried in vines and moss. It wasn't far off the trail, maybe 50 yards. At first, I thought it was a collapsed shed or maybe an old hunting blind. But as I got closer, I saw it was something else. It was a bunker, concrete walls, overgrown with moss and ferns. The door was rusted shut, but there were air vents and a small shattered window near the ground. I crouched down and looked inside. It was dark, but I could make out shapes. Boxes, furniture, maybe an old generator. There were papers scattered all over the floor, blown in by the wind. I couldn't tell what any of it was. I took a picture with my phone, but it didn't come out well. The thing that made me leave was the smell. Something inside that place had died. The scent came in waves, thick, rotten, animal-like, but deeper, older. I didn't stick around long. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch and tried to make sense of it. Why was there a bunker out here? Who built it? Why was it full of furniture? I made the decision to leave the next morning. I packed up most of my gear that night, loaded the cooler, and locked the door just in case. I barely slept again. In the early hours of Sunday morning, I started hearing noises again. This time, they weren't close. They were distant but unmistakable. A mechanical whine, faint and high-pitched, like an old motor. Then a sudden bang. Then silence. I sat up, grabbed the lantern, and waited. My rifle was already loaded. I didn't move until daylight. When I stepped outside that morning, something was different. There were footprints in the dirt. Human, barefoot. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the woods. No drag marks, no animal prints. Just the outline of toes and arches and heels in the cold morning mud. I didn't waste another minute. I shouldered my bag, took my rifle, and left everything else behind. I walked fast, checking over my shoulder the whole time. When I got to my truck, it was untouched. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I was halfway home. That night, I called my uncle and asked if he knew anything about a bunker near the ridge. He got quiet, said no, said maybe it was some old logging site, but I could tell he was lying. There was a pause in his voice, a hesitation he didn't usually have. I didn't press him. I never went back. A few months later, I looked at the pictures I'd taken again. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Inside the broken window of that bunker, just barely visible in the corner, was what looked like a figure, crouched low, not moving. Could have been a shadow, could have been anything, but it looked like someone watching me. I deleted the photo and never mentioned it again. To this day, I still wonder what I found out there, and more importantly, what found me. But I made it out. I left, and I've never spent another night alone in the woods. I don't need to know more. I just needed to survive, and I did. It was early fall of 2011, and I was 34 at the time. My job as a freelance land surveyor meant I often went off-grid for long stretches, especially in the off-seasons when people weren't around to bother me or ask questions. That year, I took on a contract to map and flag an old property line deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It belonged to some rich family who had owned a massive parcel of forested land since the 50s but never did much with it. The owners now wanted to divide it and sell off parts, so they hired me to mark everything out and photograph the terrain. The work was slow, and the terrain was dense with undergrowth and soaked from recent rain. The property stretched over 20 miles in length, with patches of old logging roads, half-collapsed deer blinds, and even some old, rusted vehicles lost in the brush. I pitched my tent about 8 miles in, near a creek. I had a generator, solar panels, and 2 weeks' worth of supplies. No cell reception, but I had a radio and a flare gun for emergencies. On the third day, while walking a ridge line that sloped down toward the northern border, I saw a structure that wasn't marked on the topo maps. From a distance, it looked like a weathered shack, buried in trees and partially collapsed. I figured it was one of those hunting cabins or trapper lodges left behind by someone who didn't care anymore. Still, I wanted to check it out and photograph it since I was supposed to document everything of note. When I got close, I realized it wasn't totally collapsed. The roof had caved in a bit near the back, but the rest looked solid. There were boot prints outside in the dirt, half dried from the last rain. That caught me off guard. They weren't mine. Someone had been there recently, maybe within a few days. I thought maybe another surveyor had come out to do a preliminary sweep or some hunter had wandered through. Still, I was deep in a part of the woods that didn't have public trails. I didn't go inside the cabin right away. I just made notes, took pictures from the outside, and flagged the coordinates. Something about it felt wrong, like I was trespassing even though I was technically hired to be there. That night, back in my tent, I couldn't shake the image of the boot prints. They had a narrow heel and long stride, deep set like someone had walked slowly and with purpose. It was the wrong kind of print for a casual hiker. The next morning, I decided to head farther north, staying away from the cabin for now. I had 2 more plots to mark, and I figured I'd swing back on my way out. The day went fine. It was quiet, peaceful even. But when I got back to my tent at dusk, something had been moved. My sleeping bag was unzipped. My pack was still there, but my spare clothes were taken out and laid on the ground like someone had been inspecting them. The cooler was untouched, but the zipper on my gear bag was half open. I froze. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I always zipped everything back. The forest was still. Too still. No wind, no birds. I scanned around and found nothing.
No sounds.
I stood still for a good 10 minutes, just listening. Nothing. Then I packed up what I could and moved. I hiked about a mile away and set up a new camp by a rock ledge, hidden behind thick pine trees. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay still in the bag with my knife gripped under the blanket. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I just waited. The next day, I returned to the original site to see if anything else was gone. Nothing was missing, but right outside my tent, placed neatly on a flat stone, was a small rusted key. It looked like it belonged to a padlock. That's when I knew someone was messing with me. I hadn't brought any keys. This one wasn't mine. It had been left for me to find. I should have packed up right then. But something in me, stupid pride, curiosity, maybe even anger, wanted to find out who it was. I figured it had to be someone squatting out here, maybe protecting something, maybe hiding. The only structure I'd seen was that half-collapsed cabin. So I went back. It was late afternoon when I reached the cabin again. I circled it first, staying low, quiet. I didn't see anyone. No sign of smoke, no sound. The door was slightly ajar. I thought about the key. I pulled it out and tried it on the rusted padlock still dangling from a loop on the inside of the door. It fit. Inside was dark and smelled like wet wood and old mold. The place was full of junk. Old cans, cracked tools, boxes of nails, torn blankets, a rotten cot. I stepped carefully. There were tracks in the dust. Someone had been inside recently, and then I saw the photos. On a shelf, behind a pile of rusted saw blades, were several printed photographs. They were all of me walking, me by my tent, me eating. They'd been taken from a distance with a zoom lens, but they were clear. One even showed me squatting to refill my water bottle at the creek, completely unaware. My skin went cold. I backed out slowly and closed the door. I didn't run. I didn't want to. I just walked, carefully, quietly, until I was out of sight of the cabin. Then I turned off my path and started moving fast. I didn't go back to my tent. I went straight west, toward the nearest road, which was about 5 miles away. I figured if I could make it by nightfall, I'd sleep in the ditch if I had to, then flag down a logging truck or hunter. But I never made it that far. At about the halfway mark, I came across a trap, an old wire snare, perfectly placed along a game trail I'd been using to navigate. It wasn't random. It was fresh. The wire wasn't rusted. And next to it, buried under a layer of moss, was a camera. A trail cam. Pulled it out. No label, no brand, just duct tape and a scratched lens. Someone had set this up to watch that trail. They knew I'd passed there. I dropped the camera, looked around, and kept moving, now off trail. I didn't want to walk into another trap. Night fell fast. I had a flashlight but didn't use it much. I didn't want to make myself a beacon. I moved until I hit the edge of an old logging road and ducked into the tree line to rest. I heard branches snap twice that night, close. Not animals. Footsteps. Someone was out there, circling. I waited until sunrise, then kept going. I reached the road by mid-morning. About half a mile down, I flagged a state truck, some forestry guy checking boundaries. He asked me why I looked like I'd slept in a ditch. I didn't tell him much, just that I'd gotten spooked by something, maybe a bear, and wanted out. He gave me a ride to town. I reported everything to the sheriff's office, left out the part about the photos at first. Just said I saw signs of someone living off-grid. They said it wasn't uncommon. Squatters, drifters, even old-timers who'd gone off the grid decades ago. They took the report, said they'd send someone out. I called the property owners and told them I was done.
No explanación.
I sent the photos, the flagged maps, the data I'd logged. They paid me, no questions asked. A few weeks later, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a small box. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, me standing by the state truck that morning, talking to the driver. It had been taken from the trees. I left town the next day and never worked another solo job that deep in the woods again.